Joining us now, our Monday panel of political strategists Grahame Morris and Bruce Hawker. Grahame, just picking up on this whole issue, it's awful for everyone involved. Clearly those DJs are going through a tough time now as well. What do you think, though, about how this feeds into the issue and debate about media regulation?
Look, I think everyone would wish it hadn't happened, but I think many of us also hope that we don't overreact here. That you know, when do politicians start regulating as to what is a prank and what is not? You know, if a kid trips a mate over in the playground or something, you know, you don't want politicians getting into this sort of area. Look, I'm an ex-journalist, and I think over the years there are a couple of things that should have been tightened up with journalism, and that is, but very rarely, and that is, if you're in your own home or your backyard and a photographer from a newspaper takes a picture in your own backyard or your own home, there's something wrong with that and it shouldn't happen. But in this case, I don't think these people are journalists, they're entertainers. And one says, well, there are some parts of Australia where you have to identify yourself and say that you are taping people. But I'm not sure that that would apply for people overseas. Now, it may well be from here on in that politicians say you've got to identify yourself, but that sort of knocks out the chaser. It knocks out a lot of funny things that Australians do, you know, with that sort of people. And we would all just hope and hope and hope that this never ever happens again, and you feel for everybody involved. But if the politicians could take just a deep breath before they do something stupid, and we end up having sort of a rule that people cannot comply with.
Yeah, I think there will be a fair bit of self-correction going on in the media in the wake of this, you would hope. Bruce Hawker, let's move on. We read today that news poll analysis of recent electoral roll changes that go to automatically. It means that when you turn 18, you're automatically on the electoral roll as of earlier this year, as of July. News poll research says this is going to cost the coalition a swing against it of about 1.5% in some marginal seats, in about 12 seats in particular. Do you think that's about right? Do you estimate that it will have that much of a change, given, you know, the younger demographic do generally lean towards the Labor and Greens parties?
Well, I haven't done the analysis myself, David, but they estimate that something in the order of 280,000 young Australians will be on the roll who would not otherwise have been on the roll. That's about 3 or 4 electorates, so it's probably in the right ballpark. But as far as I'm concerned, given that enrolling is compulsory, voting is compulsory, then this seems to me to be a very sensible move. If the opposition wants to move to have non-compulsory voting, then I guess that's another issue. But while we have a system in our country which requires people to vote, then I think it's incumbent on everybody to be on the rolls.
We heard Graham Christopher Pyne condemning this today. He described it in horrendous terms. He talked about rorting of the election system here. Is that a bit of hyperbole?
A little bit. Look, it does help the Labor Party, no doubt about that. They do this. They've already whacked the prisoners on the roll just to cook their vote a bit more. But yes, it is a partisan thing by the Labor Party. Yes, it helps them, but you could hardly mount a case that said, hey, young people shouldn't vote. Bugger all you can do about it. And yeah, we believe in people voting. We compel people to vote, so it's sort of right that they get on the roll straight away.
Cost any seats?
It won't.
May not help. But
It won't help, and the Labor Party campaigners will be saying, hey, aren't we clever?
Just one thing interestingly about all this, David, by the way, is that people think that it was the Labor Party which introduced compulsory voting in Australia. In fact, it was the Conservatives back in about 1920 or thereabouts, because Labor was much better organised through unions and other associations, and they were going out and voting in a way that Conservative voters or would-be voters weren't. So it's a bit of a myth to suggest that this was something which was introduced by, it's a big myth to say it was something that was introduced by the Labor Party. It was quite the reverse.
Now, let's just take a look at a couple of other issues. The surplus, we know off the back of figures last week, this is becoming tougher and tougher for the government to achieve, and the language is changing on whether they're going to get there or not. Bruce, what are the politics of this? How politically important is it for the government and for Wayne Swan to actually achieve the surplus?
I think this is a very tricky one for the government and for Wayne Swan in particular, because they haven't given themselves any real wriggle room, unfortunately, and I think that's going to be a significant factor. If they do decide, though, that a surplus is not a possibility, and I don't see Swan acknowledging that, by the way, then I think they would be better off moving quickly to acknowledge that rather than to wait and wait and wait. At the moment, there's probably an argument that says, given the cost of borrowing money, which is very low, it'd probably be a better case to be made for saying, well, let's go into a deficit. But given that they've been so adamant in their denials that they're going to do that, I think it's going to be very difficult. And I suspect that Swan's going to fight all the way to get a surplus at the next budget.
Well, he no doubt will fight all the way, but Grahame, if it's not going to be achieved and it's clear it's not, do you agree that it's better to get the bad news out of the way early rather than wait until sometime in the middle of next year?
Look, I don't think on this one there's ever going to be good news for the government. It is going to make Joe Hockey look like the economic guru, and he said all along that this Labor government would never produce a surplus, and it looks as if he's going to be right. You know, it will mean that this Labor government will join a long, long line of pathetic Labor governments who cannot run an economy, you know, at a time when we've got 3% growth and whatnot, and they still run a bloody deficit. God help us.
Now, Grahame, this is your last appearance with us for the year.
Yeah, I'm going on a big
before
boat
you
to
head off
Fiji.
on your boat cruise. Tell us, as we look back on 2012, what have been the highs and lows?
Well,
What are your final
look,
thoughts?
I think the big one, earlier in the year, the Prime Minister was going to have a very uncomfortable Christmas, and she survived it. Better than that, she's killed off Kevin Rudd. And I think if you look at what are the big achievements of the year, and that is that Julia Gillard is still standing. And that is a huge achievement on where she was earlier in the year. And I give any politician who sees off challenges a big tick. The other is there's no doubt Tony Abbott is still controlling the agenda. You know, if you have a look at asylum seekers, if you have a look at all the stuff on the Prime Minister's background, carbon tax, everything, it was Tony Abbott setting the agenda for the year. But the big thing that struck me, you know, half of my life has been trying to get the silent majority to support you. But it's very, very obvious to me that the silent majority now, or a silent majority, is sitting on the front bench of both sides of politics. You know, the Prime Minister has 3/4 of her ministry who should give their money back. They're not doing anything. They're bloody useless. And in the opposition, it's not much better. You know, it's being left to Tony Abbott, to Christopher Pyne, you know, to Scott Morrison to do the heavy lifting. Where's the rest of them?
Well, it's an interesting point. Bruce, we'll get your final thoughts next week, but just on that final point there, do you agree with that there are too few doing the heavy lifting on both sides?
That who's doing the heavy lifting? The leaders?
The too few people, only 3 or 4 on both sides.
Absolutely. I think that is a problem, and it's a particular problem for Tony Abbott because it makes him a very unpopular opposition leader, and that's one of the big things that comes out of 2012. Even when the Prime Minister isn't travelling particularly well and Labor's going pretty badly in the polls, not much better than we were at the beginning of the year, to be quite honest with you, Tony Abbott still is less popular than Julia Gillard. And I think that's a sad reflection on events. I think Abbott would be much better off trying to get other people to do some of the negative stuff, but I suspect it's probably too late for him. I think he's already been tainted as a very negative man. I don't think he's going to be able to escape that.
We will see. Bruce, no doubt we'll talk to you next week about your reflections on 2012 and the election year ahead. But Grahame Morris, thank you for all your contributions once again through the year. We look forward to catching up with you after your
election year
cruise once we get into the election year. Thanks for your company as well. We'll be back same time tomorrow. See you then.